and I will indeed try to kind of run you all through from the start, from the beginning in the end of the 90s when we got involved with the species to what's happening on the ground right now as we speak, and a little bit into the future. So bear with me, and there should be, I guess, some time for questions afterwards. So just to give you a quick overview, Montserrat mountain chicken, a leptodactylid frog, native and endemic to the Caribbean, to the Lesser Antilles. You can see here highlighted. We go to the next map in a second. Montserrat and Dominica. It's a very large frog. It's one of the largest frogs, up to 1 kilo in wild animals. So really extremely substantial. Down here on the left bottom, you see a satellite photo of Montserrat, where it is, yeah, that was a few years ago. You can see the volcano streaming there. We come to all that, what that means, because it's quite significant with the story with the mountain chickens. So here again, you can see mountain chickens with scale. So it's really quite a substantial frog. And indeed, it is, well, nearly kind of the largest land vertebrate on Montserrat, for example. On Dominica, obviously not, there's larger ones. But it used to be the extent of occurrence used to be here all over the place. So from St. Kitts down to Martinique, St. Lucia potentially. We're not quite sure about that, but since the last probably 200-300 years, it has been restricted to Dominica and to Montserrat, where it occurred in habitats like this. So as you can see on the bottom left, Montserrat and also Dominica, of course, quite hilly islands, volcanic, and streams and rivers have cut quite deep gorges into those mountainous areas. And in around those streams amongst the boulders, but then also in the rainy season up on the slopes is the habitat of the mountain chickens. So a forest dwelling animal where it kind of sits at night on rocks, the males mainly, and calls very loudly, extremely loudly actually. You can hear them good a kilometer away. It used to be when they were quite numerous, quite loud actually. There was quite a dense population. So as you can see here in those little notes, so you could find calling frogs 20-30 meters apart along the streams, where the males would call those whooping territorial calls. We actually know they have 4 distinct calls. One is that loud whooping call. Then there is kind of a more contact call between males and females. There is a kind of trilling call where the male calls to the female just prior to mating, and they also utter very loud alarm calls when they are caught. Longevity, maybe not as long as people would think regarding the size of the frog, but from skeletochronology we know that wild frogs tend to live about 12 years in captivity. The oldest one died of the age of 18. In the reproductive season, which coincides with the rainy season, of course, as you might expect, the males call and then occupy burrows underground. There can be old kind of small mammal burrows that were extended by the frogs. They can be under little rocks or logs, but usually under big rocks or those boulders you saw before. They go quite deep down, up to 2 meters. Burrows have been found, and at the end, in a little chamber or kind of depression, the females would construct a foam nest. And since they were so far underground, nobody really knew until we got involved in captivity with those frogs how they actually reproduce. So as I said, foam nests underground were known, and it was also known that tadpoles can reach up to 15 centimeters in those foam nests. They would stay there until metamorphosis, so they wouldn't get washed out into the streams or anything. They would stay in the foam nest up to 15 centimeters long, but the eggs were only 2 millimeters in diameter. So it wasn't quite clear how the tadpoles really developed, that really large size from a 2-millimeter egg, because no actual items of food were found in the nests, in the foam. And obviously from 2-millimeter nests, there is not eggs, there isn't enough yolk available to actually sustain a growth to 15 centimeters. So this was all a bit a mystery. Yeah, the main thing really with the mountain chickens on both islands, Dominica and Montserrat, was that they were a traditional food item. So this is a tourist website from the early 2000s, where you know, frog legs were advertised as quite a common traditional food item. And indeed, the locals on Montserrat were regularly hunting, or yeah, rather collecting those frogs for food. So it was really kind of a staple food item year round. And then that happened. So in 1995, the Sofias Hills volcano on Montserrat erupted, and erupted, I think 3 times it was, until 1998, it erupted 3 times. And what you can see here is down there, that's the old capital city of, or capital town of Montserrat, Plymouth. And you can see the extent of the devastation, the damage that the volcano did. I mean, this is, yeah, you can't even see the roofs of the houses anymore. So really, half of the island got really badly damaged by the volcano. Basically, here I drew this red line. This is the extent of the ash and lava damage that really occurred. So this, the lower half of the island here, the southern half is completely inhabitable. And indeed, it is actually an exclusion zone. So here you can see the official map from Montserrat with, in orange, the exclusion zone, where nobody can go apart from you know, people with a permit, Montserrat Volcano Observatory people, or for example. And obviously, big exodus happened. People were evacuated to numerous islands, to the UK, to the US. So the overall population, human population of Montserrat after 98 was only about a quarter to a fifth of the human population before the volcano blew up. And here you can see 2 different angles of Montserrat. Previously, all this was mountainous rainforest where mountain chickens occurred, and nowadays it is really restricted. The habitat is really restricted to the center hills here, where mountain chickens after volcano were still hanging on in good numbers, even so that people still collected them, because obviously, as I said, the human population also reduced quite a lot by being evacuated to other areas. And this is really when we got involved. We, here in Jersey, the Wildlife Conservation Trust, we got asked by the government of Montserrat whether we wouldn't want to get involved to research the mountain chicken, because obviously, as you just seen, the habitat was much, much smaller. People weren't quite sure whether they're really historically important local frog really could cling on in such a small, relatively small habitat. So we got offered 14 frogs, so 7 pairs of mountain chickens, which we took into captivity in Jersey in 1999. And you can see here our old setups. Basically, the large size of the frog led us to just keep them on the floor in rooms, here with a bit of bark chips and all that. Yeah, we set on to see what we can find out about that frog. Reproduction, any other parameters, any other habits. Nobody really knew anything. But also we got involved in training Montserrat forestry staff in, you know, monitoring of their remnant populations in that habitat that was reduced by 60%. And this was really an annual constant involvement, and more and more through fundraising, through publications, through talking to people, more and more of institutions got involved, so that actually in 2004 we were able to conduct a biodiversity assessment of those center hills of this last remaining forest habitat, together with, for example, Kew Gardens, who led the Botanic Survey, with university in the US who did the bats, with another university in the UK who did the insects, birds. So RSPB did the bird surveys. So we did a huge biodiversity assessment of the Center Hills there. But let's stay closer to home. So in Jersey, you can see here the first thing we found out in our little reproduction chambers is the proper reproductive mode of mountain chickens. So we provided them with little boxes with a tunnel as a proxy for their underground burrows. And this is one of the very first ones that were used. So just a little plastic box with a tube, and fitted on here was a infrared camera which was connected to a very old style, well, back then it was not very old style, but it was a VHS recorder that would record what happens in those burrows on a time-lapse video camera. And what we found out actually was that they have a very unique reproductive mode. So males and females get together. The male, as I said before, is occupying one of those nest chambers, utters that trilling call, entices the female into the box, and there they construct this foam nest and lay eggs. And then they protect the nest and the burrow. So that's a bit an individual thing. So some males help with the defending of the nest, some males do not, but the females will definitely stay around the nest in fairly close proximity. They don't venture far from it, even when feeding. And it goes that far that when keepers approach a nest chamber in the daily routine management, the female actually jumps at us and kind of tries to push us away, bites our hand. So it's quite an active, aggressive defense. And considering that there's actually no natural predators recorded on Montserrat for the mountain chickens, this must be really a defense against other frogs, that they don't enter the chamber and disturb the tadpoles in the nest. But what does happen is the female lays only about between 10 and 70 eggs in the nest. So the biggest clutch was, I think, 72 tadpoles ever recorded. And that's obviously a very small number of offspring for such a large frog. So you would think, you know, a frog weighs a kilo, really over 20 centimeters long. You would expect about 20,000, maybe 30,000 eggs would come out of that if you kind of look what, for example, cane toads produce or other large frogs. So a very small number of eggs is released into the foam. The tadpoles hatch. And then what happens, and that was really quite astonishing, is the female comes back into the foam, sits there about twice a week, and there you can see she feeds them with little eggs. You can see the tadpoles are kind of semi-transparent. You can actually see the food items in the GIT, in the gut system. So I'm trying to see whether you can actually see what's happening here in the video. So the female sits in the nest and she expels eggs twice a week, and the tadpoles really rear up to her cloaca, and it kind of creates kind of feeding frenzy. And they would eat nothing but those eggs. We tried to feed them with, you know, what you do with dendrobates, with other frog eggs, with chicken yolk on a syringe, and nothing works. It's really only eggs from the mother animal that those tadpoles ingest. And lo and behold, you can actually count the eggs in the stomach of the tadpoles. And if you do that like on a weekly basis and then extrapolate for the number of tadpoles, you actually find that females do produce about 20,000, 22,000 eggs over the period of the rearing of the tadpoles. So the amount of eggs produced is approximately what you expect, but the vast majority of the eggs are used to feed the tadpoles. And when the tadpoles are metamorphose in the foam, the female stays with them even when they come out of the of the nest for about a week's time, sometimes a bit longer, and they seek shelter around her. When they get disturbed, they hop amongst the female and or underneath her, and it's really quite an astonishing thing. So the very first thing that came out of that was obviously that when you have a frog species that produces such a small number of offspring, once, maybe twice a year, and you have a habitat reduction by 60%, then that is already a problem. But if the tadpoles are obligatory oophagous, they don't feed anything else but the female's eggs, then obviously hunting during the breeding season would be absolutely unsustainable, because you wouldn't just take breeding animals away, you would also kind of sacrifice the whole next generation because they would starve in their nesting burrows. So the very first thing we could tell Montserrat was to try to ban hunting in the reproductive season. So yeah, 1 point for zoos in terms of, you know, yeah, being useful in the way that it was not possible to do that research in the field. Other things at that time conducted by us and partners were really training everybody on Montserrat with marker capture techniques, with distance sampling, selecting transects, so that actually the whole population can be monitored. And we could actually see whether, you know, the numbers would stay the same, or whether hunting would take too much of a toll. We did genetic studies between the islands to find out whether there's a big difference between Dominica and Montserrat. There wasn't. So they seem to have, you know, fairly similar time of dispersal to these islands. Obviously, Montserrat, with a much smaller area, surface area, was more inbred and less genetically diverse, but otherwise they wouldn't constitute big genetically different management units. Of course, we also looked at the health of the populations. Chytrid was going around in Middle America and also a little bit in the Southern Caribbean. So we would swap frogs now and then. As I said, we did skeletochronology, and we looked at the impact of alien species on the frogs populations, because not just rats were abundant, but just when the volcano blew up, obviously everybody who left the island let all their livestock run free, because they didn't want to have them kind of die from the volcano. So you have now in Montserrat huge populations of donkeys, horses, cows, pigs, dogs, cats, guinea fowl, whatever you have in Montserrat in the hills. And people hunt them, and it seems to kind of semi-work, but yeah, we needed to know more how much of an impact those species have on the mountain chickens. And then, of course, public awareness, because we needed to get everybody on Montserrat on board to support the studies, but also support the government in the hunting ban, and kind of make it clear to everybody that, you know, if you eat them during the rainy season, and obviously you won't be able to eat them for much longer. Meanwhile, while we were screening and monitoring the population in Montserrat, and you can see down at the left, until 2007, we did not find any chytrid on Montserrat. It seems to have arrived on Dominica. So FFI started a monitoring project for mountain chickens in the year 2000, and they detected the first chytrid fungus impact in around 2002, 2003, in the winter there. And within 1.5, 2 years, it was basically extinct on Dominica. You can see down here, this is where the monitoring began. And the first sign of chytrid was found here, end of 2002. And then basically in 2004, no frogs were found or heard anymore. Until about end of 2005, where the first calls were heard again. And this is a map from, I think it's 4 years old. So you can see previously you had mountain chickens around here, there, along the rivers. And since 2006, 2007 until now, we find them here in those dark green patches. A small number. We're talking about a total of about 150 frogs, I would think. And that probably got reduced about a year ago when that big hurricane came through. So they are clinging on, but it's not very strongly. So we also not quite sure yet why they are persisting in those areas, because where they persist in those tiny little areas, we can actually not find chytrid. Everywhere else, we can swap other amphibians for chytrid and they're positive. In those areas, they're not. So we reckon it must have to do something with the environment, that those pockets here are just too dry, too hot. They're not very dense forests. They're more like garden and agricultural areas. So not really ideal for the frogs, but it seems that chytrid is not able to really have an impact there because the temperatures are probably not favorable. Yeah, and the whole screening thing and the biodiversity assessment and all that really led to the first species action plan for the mountain chicken frog in Montserrat in 2007. I might add that in 2013 we updated that, so we have a new or different action plan since then. But it was also, as you can see here, was also highlighted the chytrid management to prevent chytrid for extending to Montserrat. So we tried to, put screening on the ports into place, but it all didn't really work, or it didn't work quickly enough. Chytrid arrived. It must have done so probably by either plants or by cane toads or Eleutherodactylus, the little tree frogs, which are really common hideaways on shipping containers, which land on Montserrat. So everything in Montserrat gets shipped from mainly Dominica, a little bit from Antigua as well, but they have a lot of freight coming from Dominica by ship. And I mean, we knew it was inevitable, really, that chytrid would arrive, and it did so in 2009. In February 2009, we got the first call from Montserrat that they find on their transects lots of dead frogs. They haven't seen frogs on some chytrids near the port for a number of months without telling us, but now in the forests, also down south, they would find dead frogs. So we immediately, a month later, we went there to assess the situation, and we found, unfortunately, we found lots of dead frogs. Lots of moribund frogs with the typical chytrid signs, and indeed swabbing confirmed that it was chytrid. So we did all the postmortems, we did all the swabbing from cane toads, mountain chicken frogs, Eleutherodactylus. We did the whole lot, but it was really nothing much we could do, because the little Eleutherodactylus tree frogs, they're really everywhere. They seem not to die off with chytrid. They get infected. They have some sick animals amongst their population, but it is not, we couldn't detect any population decline with those guys. And then you have invasive species like the cane toad, which is in Montserrat for a long period of time already, and they obviously act as a reservoir. You know that they don't die from chytrid. So, and they also, as you can see here, get in fairly close contact with mountain chickens. So it was pretty much a done deal when we found out that there's a die-off. There was really not much we could do. And as you can see down here, it was really one of the, or probably the greatest ever decline of any vertebrate recorded in just 1.5 years, basically. All but, I would say, 4 or 5 animals died. What we also did in 2009, after assessing the situation, we did 2 things. And one thing was we used the situation or the opportunity, if you like, for a field trial in trying to treat the mountain chickens in the field. So here you can see the northern half of Montserrat. The port is around here. So this area was already empty of mountain chickens. We had one transect here, one stream, Fairy Walk it's called, where we had infected but still alive mountain chickens, and we had one more stream here, Pelican Gout, which had uninfected chickens. So here, the last remaining populations, but infected, we actually put into place a trial experiment. Over 15 weeks, over about 3 months, we tried to treat mountain chickens. So every evening we would walk that transect with a number of people, and we had all those frogs identified with integrated transponders, so little pit tags, so we could identify them. And we selected basically one animal we found goes to the treatment trial, one goes in a non-treatment trial with just stream water to replicate the kind of stress of handling, and a third animal we would have a non-treatment control, non-bath control, we would just release again. So we used itraconazole, just the standard fungicide you use in captivity for treating chytrid infected frogs. Obviously, in captivity, you do this once every day for 5 days, and then your frogs are usually free of chytrid. Now, in the field, we obviously couldn't find every single individual of the actual treatment trial group, so we did so whenever we did find one, and in the end, it averaged out to about every frog in the treatment trial we treated once a week, and that seemed to be enough to help them to survive, but not enough to kind of prevent them dying eventually. And especially when we stopped the trials, then within the next 2-3 months, those animals would die as well. So it kind of worked, but it was only a short-term extension of their lives. So it can be used to as a short-term solution to buy time, if you like. Obviously, helped very much because of the size of the frog, because they're so territorial, so large. Obviously, if you would do this with tiny leaf litter frogs, that would not have worked. And the second thing we did right away was from down here, that unaffected stream, we took 50 frogs. So basically the last 50 we took out, and we distributed them into a number of zoos. There was Chester Zoo, was Northern Ark Zoo in Sweden, ZSL in London, and Jersey. We took on some more of these. And they went, in all those 4 institutions, they went into specially built quarantine units. So the mountain chickens, from the frogs we got in 1999, we bred quite a lot of them, and distributed them around, and the species is under studbook management in EAZA. There's also some frogs in EAZA, so in US American institutions in zoos, but they are basically a non-quarantine, just exhibit population. With those 50 we exported in 2009, they would only go into quarantine units. As you can see here, this is the early enclosures at ZSL in London Zoo. Here is a container, Chester Zoo, built for the mountain chickens. This is at Northern Ark, and this is basically Jersey. We renovated a very large room. We put some tables in with baby swimming pools, so we could house the frogs in those baby swimming pools, and we had water disinfectant buckets underneath. We built a kind of porch in front of that room where we could change into overalls and do the whole quarantine thing. And this is how it then looked. Now it's a little bit different. We have natural substrate in there, not bark chips anymore, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. So in every one of those swimming pools we have one pair of mountain chickens, one breeding pair. Here's a bit of a close-up. So you have your water, obviously, where they can sit. You have some hides, shelter, and then you have an open area where you have a bit of UV light, and where you have your artificial burrow where they breed. And those quarantine populations in those 4 institutions, we wanted to use to breed frogs to rear juveniles, head start juveniles in quarantine conditions for reintroduction back into Montserrat. And I'll come to that in just a second. Just to point out a few challenges, obviously, you have with such a large animal, with such a large breeding program, that needs to be done in quarantine. So especially the long-term quarantine procedures are quite a task for your staff, because obviously, especially if you have staff turnover, you always have to kind of update the staff knowledge in terms of how do you do the quarantine, that your staff really needs to strictly and indefinitely adhere to procedures. So not just your import quarantine, where you go there like, you know, for a few months and then it's empty again. Now, over years and years and decades, every single day you have to really strictly adhere to your quarantine procedures. And you have to have those procedures all the same in 4 different institutions with all their keeper staff. So this is quite a thing. And obviously it takes a lot of time, because yeah, you have to spend your time changing. You have to do this all in the morning before you work with other animals. So it's quite logistically and staff managing wise, it's quite a task. And then obviously, yeah, the continuity of your knowledge, because if you have staff turnover, you probably, the ones of you who run zoological collections, you know what I'm talking about. But then also you have limits of actual biosecurity or quarantine for such a large species. For example, if you don't have the facilities or the time, the money and the time to also breed your own food in quarantine, then you need to kind of compromise there. Substrate, if you have, you know, tiny little species, 2-3 centimeters long, frogs, you can probably disinfect all your moss in your substrate you put in your little 3 by 1 foot enclosures. But if you have animals that require a whole room full of substrate, then it is really difficult to kind of disinfect that. So this is where you come to your limits. Another kind of challenge is obviously communication between the many partners. It's not just those 4 institutions, it's also research institutions, it's funding institutions, it's the government in the countries overseas. So bringing them all together and come to timely decisions that then are also carried out can be quite a challenge. What we did, you know, we looked at, while we had them well, we still have them in captivity, obviously, but we kind of looked at UV radiation, calcium supplementation, and bone density of juveniles, which has been solved. We are nearly done looking at the nutritional requirements. And you might ask, well, you know, it's 10 years ago, you're still looking at nutritional requirements? Yes, we are, and I'm happy to discuss this at the end of this talk, because it's, yeah, one of those limitations of such a large project. But we're there, we know what we're dealing with, we just don't know how to kind of put it into place in captivity. But this also goes into what is still kind of unresolved. We have a very infrequent reproductive success. So only about 7% of all those foam nests that are produced every year actually yield tadpoles. So this is still quite a conundrum we're worrying about, and that has been going on for a long time. You can see since kind of even before we had the quarantine population, that was kind of a problem. And if you ask me personally, it has much to do with the nutrition, but there's also other factors involved which we really don't have a handle on at the moment. And another big problem we have in our captive populations are cancers, basically. So we have a very high proportion of animals that die of adenocarcinoma in the GIT, so in the area where the gut adheres to or sits with the urinary bladder. It's always kind of the same area, it looks always the same, and we are still, despite looking, not quite sure where this is actually coming from. And then obviously, which is still unresolved, we have still chytrid fungus in Montserrat and in Dominica, and we can obviously not eradicate that, but we, as you will see in just a minute, we are working on that. What was good really in the last 10 years is that we managed through our breeding populations with a studbook to preserve much of the genetic material that the Montserrat lines provided. So those 50 frogs, while there's none of the founders alive anymore, we managed to breed most of the founders. So the genetic material is still alive. Yeah, and then because of it was such a big partner-driven project, it yeah, developed quite in a large number of areas. But the biggest probably was that we were able to release frogs into Montserrat 4 times between 2011 and 2013 to look at chytrid yeah, development on not just on frog populations, but on individual frogs, because basically worldwide, all the populations, or pretty much all the chytrid fungus research is done on frog populations. And with this large territorial frog, it allowed us to yeah, follow individual frogs and basically look at chytrid loads over time on an individual animal over the seasons. And we implanted little radiotransmitters in the coelomic cavity of frogs. So that's the underside of the head here. So in the coelomic cavity of most of the frogs we released, obviously all were individually identified, and they would then get released in Montserrat and radio tracked permanently until they unfortunately died, of course. So we released a large number of frogs. You can see here, twice during the rainy season and twice during the dry season. Yeah, we radio tracked them for 3 months, and we have found a very distinct difference between chytrid load and die-offs in the dry season versus in the wet season. So in the dry season, the frogs don't disperse much because it's very dry. They sit down in the streams, in the little water-filled pools that are available, and obviously they sit there together. They sit there together with cane toads and with tree frogs, and chytrid gets spread around much left and right. So chytrid loads are high, frogs die quickly. In the wet season, when the streams are running wild, the frogs disperse up on the slopes into the forest, and obviously are not much in contact with each other or with other amphibians. So the dispersal of the frogs is far and wide, and the infection rate is much, much slower, and the die-offs occur also much later. Here you can see that as a proxy for the BD infection loads. This is from the tree frogs. So you can see here, up and down quite regularly. If I overlay this with the rainfall pattern, so rainy season here, low chytrid. Dry season here, high chytrid. Rainy season, low chytrid. Dry season, high chytrid. Okay, pretty obvious. So, and then what was next? In Dominica, we're still trying to figure out why the frogs are not dying in those few areas. Is it really only the environmental factors, or did some kind of resistant mutations develop? In Montserrat, we also had 2 frogs, a male and a female, which survived 5 years after chytrid. Only 2 frogs. So we pit tagged them. We individually marked them before chytrid. So in 2007, I think we caught them the very first time, and they were still alive in 2015. So there must be frogs around that have some kind of resistance. And that might also play into the Dominica population. And what we then wanted to do, and which is in the last few slides, we would want to try out whether we can keep frogs alive in Montserrat, not by treating them, but by modifying habitat. In captivity, the main thing was to breed frogs for the release in Montserrat, not just for those radio tracking studies I just talked about, but also so we can release frogs in modified habitats. And then, as I said, the two things we really need to focus on and we are currently looking at is nutrition and those adenocarcinomas in captive frogs. And this is really what's happening now. This is Montserrat. This is a fenced-in habitat plot. And we just did this year. So beginning of the year, we employed a full-time staff who manages this together with the forestry department in Montserrat. We fenced in a large area, divided this in half. So we have 2 experimental plots, and we manipulated the canopy. So we cut some canopy down here and some here to have more sun penetration, to have this area here and there more dry and hotter, versus here is more shaded, a bit cooler, a bit wetter. And we also installed artificial ponds here and here, but also underneath the canopy here. And we are heating those ponds with solar heaters. And what we are trying to do is to keep the water temperature around 30 to 31, 32 degrees in those ponds, which is above the threshold of the chytrid fungus. So we are trying to kind of simulate what we see in Dominica with those open areas and provide the frogs little heated pools where they can go in, or they would go into the water in the evening, at night, and that they hopefully be able to treat themselves from chytrid. And we hope that we can that way keep the chytrid load on the frogs low enough that they can survive that. Now this is a bit of close-up of the fence. So we kept the mesh size in a way that arthropods can still go in and out, but rats and cane toads can't go in. This is here, so the rats and the cane toads can't enter. And those are kind of our heated pools with a battery that is powered by solar panels during the day and releases energy for little aquarium heaters that are safely stored in there so the frogs don't burn themselves. And we keep the temperature around those kind of parameters, which we tried in captivity. So the frogs are happy with us. Water temperature, they don't suffer ill effects. They stay in the water as long as they do with unheated pools. So that was confirmed in the captive populations up front, obviously. So yeah, this is what happened now. So we released the first 30 frogs in July. We have now their permanent team over there. So we have keepers from all the zoo institutions involved going over there, helping out. We catch up all the frogs in there every month for swabbing and take in morphometrics. So we also obviously make sure that they eat enough, that they stay healthy. We obviously have to prune vegetation, and 3 times a week they get additionally fed and checked, because we also have to breed insects. So we have a kind of insect breeding facility here established where we breed local, native and local established invertebrate species, crickets and cockroaches, as you can see here. So they supplement basically the food in those small enclosures because the frogs have really a very strong appetite, so you need to additionally feed them. And yeah, there we are. The dry season, i.e. if you listen carefully, the chytrid season is approaching fast. So we are also on standby with itraconazole. So we obviously know from our trials that it works. So therefore our weekly checks, and if we pick up animals that display infection signs of chytrid, the typical red patches, dry skin, then we are there and can be able to treat them. We can also put them in captivity in Montserrat. We have still the old enclosures from the exports and imports still there. And yeah, we are also obviously monitoring the ponds with cameras. So we know which frog how often uses the ponds. We regularly swap them, and we hope that the frogs are still there by the end of the dry season next year. And this is where we are. Thank you very much.